Our gospel today is from the Gospel of John. We are in chapter 6, verses 25 through 35. In my Bible, it's entitled, Jesus, the Bread of Life. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? And Jesus answered, very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. And then they asked him, what must we do to do the works God requires? And Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. And so they asked him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. And then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. This is the reading of the word of our Lord. You may be seated. It was the final examination for an introductory biology course at the local university. Like many such freshman courses, it was designed to weed out new students, having over 500 students in the class. Ever been in a class like that? I have. And boy, is it intended to weed out the students. Nothing fun about it. I got a passing grade with like a 23% on my test because it was above average. Crazy. Oh, that's the way the tests were written. Yeah, deliberately to weed you out. So anyway, back to my story. The examination was 2 hours long. That was common. And exam booklets were provided. That was common as well. The professor was very strict and told the class that any exam that was not on his desk in exactly 2 hours would not be accepted and the student would fail. Half an hour into the exam, a student came rushing in and asked the professor for an exam booklet. You're not going to have time to finish this, the professor stated sarcastically as he handed the student a book. Yes, I will, replied the student. He then took a seat and began writing. After 2 hours, the professor called for the exams, and the students filed up and handed them in, all except the late student who continued writing. An hour later, the last student came up to the professor who was sitting at his desk preparing for his next class. He attempted to put his exam on the stack of exam booklets already there. No, you don't. I'm not going to accept that. It's late. The student looked incredulous and angry. Do you know who I am? The student said. No, as a matter of fact, I don't, replied the professor with an air of sarcasm in his voice. Do you know who I am? The student asked again in a louder voice. No, and I don't care, replied the professor with an air of superiority. Good, replied the student, who quickly lifted the stack of completed exams, stuffed his in the middle, and walked out of the room. Sometimes it's kind of important to know who you are, doesn't it? Or who they are. Our message today is about the 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. Now, last week we talked about the 7 what? Miracles. Anybody remember that? Probably not. 7 miracles, 7 I am statements. You notice this number 7 keeps showing up. Any thoughts on that? You know, in the time of Christ and in Jewish tradition, 7 was a really important number. It was a number that indicated wholeness or completeness, if you will. It made things complete. It tied it up in a bundle, if you will. And so it's not surprising that we find in the Gospel of John 7 miracles. It's not stated anywhere that there will be 7 or that there even are 7, but that's how many are there. And it's interesting in the Gospel of John that we also find 7 I am statements. And if you have spent any time in the Bible at all, you're going to find the number 7 a lot. 7 times 70 may ring a bell in your mind. The Greek for I am is ego I am me. Ego I am me. It means I am he. It means I exist. Or in the way that we hear it translated in most of our Bibles, I am. Now, this was significant to the Jews, this I am statement. If you know a little bit about the story of the Exodus, you'll remember about the burning bush. Remember about the burning bush? So Moses sees this bush on fire, and he starts to walk towards the bush, and there's a voice from heaven that says to Moses, "Stop. Take off your shoes." Okay? You are entering holy ground. Well, Moses kind of looks around, wonders where this voice is coming from. And he says, "Who's speaking?" And the response is, "I am. I am." It's not exactly a name to us, is it? But it was to indicate God himself. I am. We sometimes hear it called the great I am. And Moses said, "I am? What's that mean? How I need to tell the people something that about who you are." And the response from God was, "Tell them I am sent you." Tell them I am. That's Exodus 3:14, by the way. Tell them I am sent you. Now, the Hebrew name for God is Yahweh. And when you see it written out the way it originally was, there are no vowels. So we kind of make up vowels for that name. There's another name that we often hear for God, and that's Jehovah, which I did some research on, and apparently is just a mispronunciation of Yahweh. So when you hear that, it's just another name that we've come up with. But what God said is, I am. What does it mean that God calls himself I am? For the Jews, it meant that he was the source of life. In fact, he was the source of all things. And we believe that about God, right? He is the source of all things. But then this guy shows up, human, flesh and blood, wearing clothing just like the local people, speaking the language of the local people, sitting in circles and teaching. And he was audacious enough to say, I am. The Jews had no problem accepting that from God, but from this guy, this man that they met, they had a lot of problem accepting it from him. Because when Jesus said, I am, he was making a claim. And what was that claim? Yeah, he was claiming to be God. That was hard for the people of the day. And sometimes it's hard for people in this day as well. That's for sure. Jesus said, I am. And he said it 7 times in the Gospel of John. The first time he said it was our passage today, I am the bread of life. Now we know that the bread is important in the New Testament, and we mostly know that because of communion. Next Sunday, we'll celebrate communion, and bread is a part of that celebration, and Jesus is the one that made bread a part of that celebration. And you remember what Jesus said about the bread when he was at the table with his disciples? He said, this represents my body broken for you. I am the bread of life indicated a sacrifice, didn't it? My body is being broken for you so that you might have eternal life. And why bread to begin with? Because bread is essential for life. As long as there have been people, it seems like there's been bread. Bread indicates anything that we need to eat to live. And if we need bread to live in this world, then there's a special bread that we need to live in the next world. And the name of that bread is Jesus. Simple as that. One time when I was in France, I was driving down a kind of a busy city road in France, and I was following a moped. Anybody know what a moped is? A few of you, maybe. It's a bicycle that has a little motor on it, and you can pedal the bicycle or you can use the motor to motor along. And, they'll go 20, 25 miles an hour, something like that. So if you're following the moped in a car, you're not going very fast. The street was dusty. There was, out of the back of this moped was a plume of blue smoke coming out of the exhaust of the moped. And the most amazing thing about this moped was that on the bicycle rack that was above the rear tire, there were about a dozen loaves of bread. Now, this bread wasn't wrapped in anything. It was just bungee strapped down, to the back of this thing. These are baguettes. They're about that long and about this big around. They're 90% crust, and they're wonderful. Although my wife would disagree. But at any rate, here's this bread going down the street. I don't know if this person was making deliveries for a bakery or something, but that image has never left my mind of that bread strapped to the back of this moped in the dusty, dirty environment that we found ourselves. Bread is essential to life. It exists in every culture and every time that we have documented some kind of bread. And Christ is essential to eternal life. And therefore, he says, I am the bread of life. Number 2, I am the light of the world. That's John 8:12. One of the things that Rhonda and I like to do is go into caves. Any of you go into caves? Now, my brother is a spelunker, okay? He climbs in holes in the ground, crawls on his belly, swims through underground rivers. No, I don't do any of that. We go into what's called commercial caves. You pay your money, you walk on a path that they've made, you don't have to duck too often anyway, and we get to go through the cave and see. One of the things that happens when you're on a cave tour, at least often if you're on a guided cave tour, is they ask you to turn off all your lights, Turn off your flashlights, because most of us have never had an experience of absolute darkness. No matter where we go, there's some kind of light in almost all cases. There's moonlight, there's starlight, there's the glow from a watch or from a phone or from a clock radio. There's just always some light around us. But when you go into the cave, they tell you to turn out the lights. And we all do, and we get an experience of absolute darkness. It's a profound experience to have absolute darkness. And then when they turn the light back on, your eyes kind of hurt, because your eyes kind of adjust to the darkness before the light comes back. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. One of the images in the Bible related to light is the pit. Have you heard about the pit? The pit is mentioned actually quite often in the New Testament. And the pit can indicate a lot of things in the New Testament. It can indicate a grave, or it can indicate a trap, a hole in the ground that traps wildlife. But one of the common elements of the pit is it's dark. There's no light in there. When I was in Jerusalem, we went into a pit. These pits were carved out of the rock into the ground. And if you have been in the Middle East, it's all rock. It's rock. Everything's rock. This pit was probably 25, 30 feet in diameter. And on the inside, going down the pit, was a staircase along the wall that went down. And this particular pit that we went down into had been a cistern. It held water. And so no matter how deep the water was in the cistern, they would walk down this staircase carved out of the stone and be able to reach the water with their buckets in order to get water. When we were down in the pit, we turned out all the lights. And it was one of those moments when we experienced absolute darkness in the pit. And while we were down there, one of the people in our group read Lamentations 3:55. I called your name, Lord, from the depths of the pit. Now, the reality is that most of us in our lives experience some kind of pit from now and again. We experience these really dark times in our life. We experience depression and pain and physical illness and monetary issues and relationship issues and all these things that represent the pit. And sometimes we forget what Jesus said about himself. I am the light of the world. If you want out of the pit, that's where to find the light. Number 3, I am the gate of the sheep, or the door of the sheep. That's John 10:7. Depends on how it was translated. But I am the door of the sheep, or the gate of the sheep. We talked, I think some other time, about what a sheep pen is. And it's just a stack of rocks. It's a rock fence, a stack of boulders that is in a circle or in a square, and these boulders contain the sheep. In order to let the sheep in and out of the pen of stacked rocks, do you remember how they let them in and out? The gate or the door is not on a hinge. It's nothing that swings. Instead, they go to a portion of the wall and they unstack the rocks in order to make an opening. The sheep enter or exit, and they stack the rocks back up then to contain them. That's what the gate of the sheep pen looks like in the Middle East in Jesus' time. Have you ever gone down a long hallway and there were a whole lot of unmarked doors along that hallway? And you're not able to find the door you need. And so you're kind of opening doors as you go along. Some of them are locked. You know, you find the janitor's closet and the boiler room and eventually maybe the restroom you're looking for or whatever, or the stairwell that you're looking for in this hallway of unmarked doors. One time I was in the hospital. It was one of the very first times that I did a visitation at Tamik, Northern Light now. It's already changed names 3 times, and I've only been here a few years. I was going into Tamik, and I was supposed to be visiting someone in ICU. Now, if you've been in Tamik and you've gone to ICU, which I'm sure many of you have, there's this secret little hallway off to the right that you have to follow in order to get, and you go around the elevators, and eventually you can find. So the lady at the desk asked me, do you know your way? And I said, no, I didn't know my way. And she said, come on, I'll show you. And so she acted as my guide, and she went down and turned into the little secret hallway. We went past doors after door after door that wasn't marked. But eventually, she showed me the door that I needed to go through in order to get into ICU at Tamik and visit the person that I needed to visit. When Jesus says he is the gate or the door of the sheep, what do you think he's saying? Well, I need to tell you it's more than a guide. It's not just a guide. A guide is kind of the part of it, and we're going to get to one of his I am statements where he says, I am the way. That will be more about being a guide. But when he says, I am the gate, Jesus is saying that you have to pass through him in order to get to heaven. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? And it's pretty exclusive because through Jesus is the only way there. I am the gate of the sheep. Number 4 is I am the good shepherd. And again, that's more than a guide. Has anybody ever been on one of those whitewater rafting trips? Anybody? No? Oh, all right. You must have money. Those things are expensive, aren't they? I've never been on a whitewater rafting trip, but I like to watch these outdoor shows, on TV sometimes. So I live vicariously through the camera. And it's kind of amazing, these whitewater rafting trips. They have a guide on the trip. The guide knows how to control the boat. He knows what rocks to miss in the river. The river only goes one way, so I don't think he's much of a guide in terms of where you need to go, but he helps keep you safe. But the guide does even more than that. In the evening, the guide gets out the tents and sets up the tents, and the guide starts the fire, and the guide prepares the meals, and the guide gets out his guitar, and sings for you and entertains you. This guide does everything, at least the ones I've seen on TV. It's more than just a guide, isn't it? It's more than just saying, go downstream, all right? Because most of us could find our way downstream. The guide is providing for every need that you have on that trip. When Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, is more than a guide. He's providing for every need you have, as well as showing the way. That was number 4. Number 5, I am the resurrection and the life. That's John 11:25. One of the points that I want to make about this is that when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, he's really talking about two different things, two inclusive things. And I want to make that really clear to you. There's a lot of people that believe I need Jesus to get to heaven. Is that true? It's absolutely true. Yeah, that's a fact. And so we focus, when we're focusing on Jesus, we're focusing on eternity. But Jesus isn't part of our lives just for eternity. He's part of our lives for here, and he's part of our lives for now. He wants to make our lives better here on earth and give us an eternity. When Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, he's talking about life in this world as well as life in the next. And that's important to know. We all know the story of Lazarus, or at least most of us do, right? Lazarus is really ill. He's dying. And so friends of Lazarus go to where Jesus is teaching, and they say to Jesus, Lazarus is dying. Please come save his life. And Jesus said, I'm kind of busy. I'll be there. Don't worry about it. Well, Lazarus dies. He dies and he's buried. And the folks, his friends, like Mary and others, they're a little upset about it, because Jesus didn't come and save him. And now he was gone. It was 2 or 3 days before Jesus showed up where Lazarus had been buried. And, I can just imagine that these folks are all angry with him because he didn't do what they knew he could do. He didn't save Lazarus' life. So, we all know what happens next, right? The people considered Lazarus to be beyond his expiration time, right? He was funky. He was smelly. The bodies didn't last well in that environment. And so there was no hope that Jesus could do anything about it now. He was too late. You think God can be too late? Well, if he can, it wasn't proven in the story of Lazarus, because Jesus said, come out of that grave, and Lazarus came out. Jesus has power, and that means he has power over life. He has power over death. He even has power over time. 3 days? That doesn't mean anything to God. 3 days doesn't mean anything. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Power over death. Power over time. Number 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Okay, Jesus is starting to repeat himself a little bit here. The truth is new, however. But he's getting a little frustrated because he has to say it over and over and over. People don't get it. They aren't understanding when he says, I am. And so this time he said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. So, one of the things I would say about this is that God is patient. And until we get it, he'll keep saying it. Until we get it, he'll keep saying it. He tells us who he is, and it's our job to believe. Number 7, the very last one, is Jesus says, I am the true vine. The true vine. John 15:1. No branch can live, let alone produce fruit by itself. Isn't that something? Have you ever seen a branch cut off from the tree that grows an apple? None happen. It will never happen. I owned some woods, 20 acres of woods one time, and it had a river, and it had a swamp, and all this wonderful land that I enjoyed. And one of the things that grew in that woods were these huge vines. They're about, some of them were 4 or 5 inches in diameter. And the vines would grow up the sides of trees. And they would cling to the trees, and eventually they would kill the trees. It wasn't obvious that the trees were dead because it was all green on top, and all the green was the vine and its branches up there growing up. So I started by cutting the vine off at the bottom, thinking, that it would all die. You know what it did? It grew back together. That didn't work. So then I started cutting out, a 6 or 8 inch section of the vine so it couldn't grow back together. And sure enough, it would die. And after a year or so, I was able to pull it down out of the tree and save the tree. The branches cannot do what they're designed to do if they aren't attached to the vine. Who's the vine? It's Jesus, isn't it? It's God. Jesus is the vine. And who are the branches? We're the ones that were created to produce fruit. Now, we have this wonderful connection within our congregation with each other. We produce fruit by caring for each other, by loving each other, by sending prayer blankets and praying for each other. That's one of the ways that we produce fruit. But we don't just have a connection within this congregation. We have a larger connection, really powerful and wonderful ones, such as in this community, right? We're a part of this community, and we are woven into the fabric of this community and have been for well over 100 years as a congregation. It's a wonderful thing. It's God's intent, and it's the way that we produce fruit by staying connected to Him and to each other's. One of the things that will be happening during Lent is we will be having a Maundy Thursday service here. And that Maundy Thursday service is a community worship service, a time where all the churches of the community, and more are going to be involved this year even than were last year, come together in our sanctuary and worship God. And it's a beautiful and powerful and wonderful time during Holy Week, and I hope you will all plan to be there and be connected with our community. God bless.